There is a building in Hsinchu, Taiwan, smaller than most American shopping malls, that produces roughly 90% of the world's most advanced semiconductors. The chips inside every iPhone, every fighter jet's targeting system, every AI data center training the next generation of large language models, and every car built in the last 5 years. The company is Taiwanese Semiconductor Manufacturing Company, TSMC. And the number that should terrify every defense planner, central banker, and tech executive on Earth is this: a sustained disruption to TSMC's advanced fabrication capacity. Whether from a Chinese blockade, an earthquake, or a war, would remove an estimated $1 trillion in annual global economic output within the first year, according to multiple independent economic modeling exercises, including assessments from the Rhodium Group and Bloomberg Economics. Not a recession, not a downturn. A near-total halt to the production of every device, weapon system, and AI model that depends on chips below the 7-nanometer threshold, because there is, right now, no factory outside Taiwan capable of replacing that capacity at anything close to the volume the modern global economy depends on. This is what defense and technology analysts call Taiwan's Silicon Shield. The theory that Taiwan's irreplaceable role in global chip manufacturing is itself a deterrent against Chinese invasion, because a war that destroyed or seized TSMC's fabrication plants would inflict catastrophic economic damage on China itself, on the United States, and on every advanced economy simultaneously, making the prize not worth the cost, even for an aggressor willing to absorb massive military and diplomatic costs. The theory is elegant. The problem is that nobody, including the people who invented the theory, is fully confident it would actually hold in a real crisis. And the gap between the theory and the operational reality is where the actual risk to the global economy lives. Start with the concentration numbers, because they are almost impossible to overstate. TSMC alone manufactures approximately 90% of the world's most advanced logic chips, those built on process nodes of 7 nanometers or smaller, the chips that power everything from the iPhone's processor to NVIDIA's AI training chips to the guidance systems in advanced missiles. Taiwan as a whole, including TSMC and smaller competitors like UMC, accounts for roughly 60% of all global semiconductor foundry revenue and an even higher share of the most advanced nodes specifically. No other country, not South Korea, not the United States, not China, comes remotely close to replicating this capability, because semiconductor fabrication at the cutting edge is one of the most capital and knowledge-intensive industrial processes ever developed, requiring multi-billion-dollar fabrication plants, extreme ultraviolet lithography machines that only one company in the world, the Dutch firm ASML, can manufacture, and decades of accumulated process engineering knowledge that cannot be replicated quickly, even with unlimited capital. TSMC's own most advanced facility, the planned 2-nanometer fab in Hsinchu, represents a capital investment north of $20 billion for a single production complex, and even that figure understates the true barrier, since the surrounding supplier ecosystem, the specialty chemical providers, the equipment maintenance technicians, the materials science expertise built up over 4 decades, cannot be transplanted to a new location on any timeline shorter than a decade, regardless of money spent. This concentration did not happen by accident, and understanding why reveals exactly how fragile the current arrangement is. Taiwan's dominance in advanced chip manufacturing emerged from a deliberate, decades-long industrial strategy beginning in the 1980s, when the Taiwanese government, working with returning Taiwanese-American engineers from Silicon Valley, established TSMC specifically as a pure-play foundry, a company that manufactures chips designed by other companies rather than designing and selling its own, a business model that didn't exist before TSMC pioneered it at scale. This model allowed American chip design firms like Apple, NVIDIA, AMD, and Qualcomm to focus entirely on design and intellectual property while outsourcing the astronomically expensive manufacturing step to Taiwan, a division of labor that proved so efficient that virtually the entire American semiconductor industry restructured itself around it over the following 3 decades. By the time American policymakers in Washington began seriously discussing the strategic risk of this concentration around 2019 and 2020, the structural dependency was already so deep that reversing it would take, by the most optimistic American government estimates, at least a decade and hundreds of billions of dollars, an estimate the CHIPS Act's actual implementation timeline has so far validated, rather than disproven. The CHIPS Act itself, signed into law in 2022 with $52.7 billion in subsidies for domestic semiconductor manufacturing, was the most direct American policy response to this vulnerability, and TSMC's own $65 billion investment in 3 fabrication plants in Arizona represents the most concrete result of that policy to date. But the Arizona facilities, even when fully operational, are expected to produce advanced chips at a fraction of TSMC's total Taiwan-based capacity. And crucially, TSMC has been explicit, including in statements from its own founder Morris Chang, that the company's most advanced process technology, the cutting-edge nodes that matter most for AI and defense applications, will remain concentrated in Taiwan for the foreseeable future, both for competitive and strategic reasons that Taiwan's government has every incentive to encourage, since TSMC's irreplaceability is functionally Taiwan's most valuable geopolitical asset. Keeping the most advanced manufacturing on Taiwanese soil is not an accident of corporate strategy. It is, implicitly, a deliberate reinforcement of the silicon shield deterrence logic itself. Here is where the theory meets its hardest test, the China side of the equation. China's own ambitions to develop an indigenous semiconductor industry capable of matching Taiwanese and South Korean capability have been a stated national priority since at least 2014, backed by hundreds of billions of dollars in state investment through vehicles like the National Integrated Circuit Industry Investment Fund. Despite this investment, Chinese domestic foundries, led by SMIC, remain several generations behind TSMC, generally estimated at 5 to 7 years behind the most advanced commercial nodes, a gap that American semiconductor export controls imposed since 2022, specifically restricting the sale of extreme ultraviolet lithography equipment and advanced chip design software to Chinese entities, have been explicitly designed to widen rather than narrow. This creates the central strategic tension that makes Taiwan simultaneously more valuable and more dangerous as a flashpoint with each passing year. China cannot domestically replace what it might gain by controlling Taiwan's existing fabrication capacity, which means a Chinese move against Taiwan is not really about acquiring new territory in the traditional sense. It is, in significant part, about acquiring the single most strategically valuable industrial asset on the planet, one that American export controls have made structurally impossible for China to replicate on its own within any policy-relevant timeframe. This is precisely why the most sophisticated wargame scenarios run by American defense planners do not assume China would simply capture TSMC's facilities intact in an invasion scenario. TSMC itself, along with the Taiwanese government and reportedly in coordination with American officials, has developed contingency plans, sometimes referred to informally as a scorched earth option, under which Taiwan's most advanced fabrication equipment could be disabled or destroyed rather than allowed to fall into Chinese hands in the event of an invasion, a scenario TSMC's own chairman has publicly acknowledged would render the facilities not operable if Chinese forces attempted to seize them by force. This is the silicon shield's actual mechanism in practice. Not that China would be deterred by the economic damage of war alone, but that the specific prize China would be fighting for, intact, operational advanced fabrication capacity, might not exist anymore by the time any invasion force secured the facilities, which removes much of the rational economic incentive for invasion in the first place, even as it does nothing to reduce the political and nationalists. Incentives that may still drive Chinese decision-making regardless of the economic calculus. The American economic exposure here deserves its own examination, because the United States is not a neutral observer in this calculus. It is one of the parties most exposed to a Taiwan crisis, despite being thousands of miles away. American companies design the chips TSMC manufactures, and American consumers and industries are overwhelmingly dependent on uninterrupted access to them. A 2024 Federal Reserve research paper modeling a one-year disruption to Taiwanese chip supply estimated a reduction in U.S. GDP of between 5 and 10%, a contraction roughly comparable to or exceeding the 2008 financial crisis, driven not just by direct electronics industry effects, but by the cascading impact across automotive manufacturing, which depends on chips for everything from engine control units to infotainment systems, defense production, where guided munitions and advanced aircraft depend on specific high-end chip components with no alternative supplier, and the broader AI and cloud computing industry, which depends entirely on NVIDIA and similar chips that only TSMC can currently manufacture at the necessary scale and precision. This is the uncomfortable truth underneath all the geopolitical rhetoric about Taiwan. The United States talks about defending Taiwan in terms of democratic values and regional security commitments. But the deepest, most immediate American interest in Taiwan's security is an industrial dependency that successive administrations created, mostly unintentionally, through 40 years of outsourcing decisions that nobody at the time understood would eventually constitute a single point of failure for the entire advanced global economy. Project this forward, and the scenario planning splits into roughly 3 paths over the next 5 to 10 years. Scenario 1. Continued deterrence equilibrium. China continues to expand military pressure around Taiwan through naval exercises, airspace incursions, and economic coercion, but does not attempt actual invasion or blockade, calculating that the economic self-damage, combined with the uncertain military outcome of an amphibious invasion against a heavily defended island, continues to outweigh the strategic benefit, especially while the Silicon Shield deterrence logic remains intact. Most defense and intelligence assessments assign this the highest probability over the medium term, often cited in the 55 to 65% range, reflecting the genuinely unusual durability of deterrence equilibria once they're established, particularly when reinforced by mutual economic catastrophe risk on this scale. Scenario 2. Successful diversification reducing the stakes. American, Japanese, and European investment in alternative fabrication capacity, combined with continued Chinese investment in indigenous capability, gradually reduces global dependence on Taiwanese fabrication over a decade-long horizon, lowering the economic stakes of any future Taiwan crisis, even if the political and military tensions persist. This is assigned moderate probability, typically 20 to 25%. Constrained by the multi-decade timeline required for any alternative fabrication ecosystem to match Taiwanese capability at the most advanced nodes. Scenario 3. Direct conflict or blockade. A Chinese decision to forcibly resolve the Taiwan question through outright invasion, a naval blockade, or a more limited coercive action like seizing offshore islands, triggered by political developments inside Taiwan, China's own internal political calculations, or a miscalculated escalation spiral. Risk assessments generally place this at 15 to 25% probability within the coming decade, a figure that has risen rather than fallen over the past several years as Chinese military modernization, including amphibious assault capability and missile stockpiles specifically configured for a Taiwan scenario, has accelerated faster than most Western intelligence assessments anticipated even 5 years ago. Whichever path unfolds, the single building in Hsinchu, and the dozen or so other advanced fabrication facilities clustered across Taiwan's science parks remain the most consequential piece of industrial infrastructure on the planet that almost no one outside the semiconductor industry could locate on a map. The world spent 4 decades optimizing for efficiency, concentrating the most critical step in the most important supply chain on Earth into a single, geopolitically contested island because it was cheaper and more efficient to do so, and nobody who benefited from that efficiency stopped to calculate what happens if the island in question becomes a battlefield. The Silicon Shield may well continue to hold. It has held, imperfectly, for decades already. But a deterrence theory that depends on the threat of destroying the very asset it's meant to protect is not a stable long-term foundation for the global economy to rest on, and every year that passes without a credible plan B is another year the entire world is betting its most important industry on a single small island successfully avoiding a war that 2 great powers are simultaneously preparing for and trying to prevent.